Can you believe it? It's officially been 3 years since we went on our American road trip together, the series in which I covered one true horror story from every US state. Since we've all been spending too much time indoors recently, I thought it was about time for us to do some travelling together again. This time though, we're ditching the roads and taking to the skies. That's right. Welcome to the first episode of Lazy Masquerade's Horror World Tour. From the Far East to the Wild West, and from maniacs to urban legends, we'll be exploring 50 true horror stories from 50 different countries, spread across 10 uploads, 5 haunting tales apiece. I'll try to keep it to 1 or 2 stories from any given continent per video. That should help keep things varied, and we'll get to hear stories from every part of this mad world. So, now that boarding's complete, sit back, relax, and enjoy your in-flight entertainment on Flight 666. My wife Rosie and I used to live in Austin, in a great little neighborhood, the perfect place to raise our 2 sons, who were just 7 and 9 at the time. We'd moved to Texas to be closer to my wife's side of the family, whom she was really close with, and who were going through a rough patch at that time. Rosie's brother, Ted, had some serious issues. He was staying with their parents, who were taking good care of him, but they were getting on in years, and Rosie really wanted to move closer to home so that she could lend a helping hand and offer Ted some support. I was between jobs, and didn't have much in the way of family to speak of. Plus, a change of scenery sounded great at that time, so there was nothing keeping us rooted in California. As such, we upped sticks and moved to cowboy country. My wife, being a nurse, found it easy to get a new job very quickly, and while I looked for work, I remained a stay-at-home dad. It was a lazy Friday night. Rosie was on call, working a night shift at the hospital. Our 2 boys were already tucked up in bed, and I was downstairs on my laptop, looking through some job listings, and taking the odd YouTube break here and there. At around 11 PM, my phone started ringing. That was weird. Nobody ever called that late at night. Worried that it might be urgent, I checked the caller ID. It was my wife, Rosie. I answered, and I'll never forget how frantic and serious she sounded. "John, get the kids out of the house." "What? Rosie, what's going... John, get them out of the house, now. Just take them somewhere safe." "Darling, calm down. Tell me what's going on." "It's Ted. He's just killed Mum and Dad, and I think he's on the way to our house right now." My head went light. I scrambled to think of questions to ask her. What exactly did Ted do to their parents? How did she know he was coming here? What was he going to do when he arrived? In hindsight, I can think of a million questions I could have asked, but in that moment, my head seemed to be empty of any rational thought. My fight or flight switch had just been triggered instantly. As I ummed and erred, Rosie just kept on insisting I get the kids and go, now. I took a breath and started thinking straight again. Told her I was on it, and that I'd call her back soon. I hung up and bounded up the stairs to wake the boys. But when I reached the top, I could hear a car pulling up outside our house. Oh no. Don't let it be him, I thought to myself. I looked out through the upstairs hallway window, and down below in our driveway, his car parked on our lawn with the driver's door open, was Ted. Our upstairs hallway light was on, and he could clearly see me, standing at the window, looking down at him. His hands were both hidden in the mid-pocket of his hoodie. He slowly removed one, and held up a large kitchen blade. Until a few moments before, it had just been a relaxed Friday night like any other, and now, in the blink of an eye, I had just been thrown into a do-or-die situation. But I wasn't scared for myself. I was scared for my sons. I rushed into their bedrooms to shake them both awake. There was no way to escape now, and no time to explain. I quickly grabbed a pair of scissors from one of the drawers, hurried them both into the upstairs bathroom, turned off the light, and locked the door. I went to grab my phone to call the cops, but my pocket was empty. I'd left it downstairs after hanging up on Rosie. My boys were both confused and freaking out at this point, but I told them to stay calm and stay quiet. Opening the bathroom window slightly, I could hear footsteps walking around the perimeter of our house. Then, smash. One of the downstairs windows shattered. Ted had broken in. I clutched the scissors tightly in my hand, told the kids to stand in the bath, and closed the shower curtain. For the longest time, we could hear Ted moving around downstairs, going from room to room, looking for us. Then came the sound that scared me the most. The sound of footsteps going up the stairs. This was it. There was no getting out of this one. If Ted kicked in the bathroom door, I was going to rush him and pray that I could overpower the guy. He was bigger than me, and of course he had the weapon advantage, but maybe my instincts as a father would help me take him down. I had to protect my sons, even if it killed me. Thankfully, I didn't have to play that game of coin toss. The terrifying sound of Ted moving up the stairs was interrupted by police sirens. Rosie had already called them and told them about Ted, how he might have been coming to our house that night. Another call from our neighbor, who saw Ted breaking in, had made them drive faster to our location. It was miraculous timing, that's all I can say. Ted didn't even try to run. He waited for the cops to come charging into the house. He wouldn't drop the blade though, so they ended up forcefully restraining him and taking him into custody. Finally, it was safe for us to leave our makeshift panic room. Turns out that Ted came prepared. He had brought along zip ties, tape, and plastic bags with him. Information that became all the more horrifying when we found out how he killed his and Rosie's elderly parents. He had held them down, tied their hands behind their backs, and taped plastic bags over their heads so they couldn't breathe. That was no doubt the fate he had in store for us. Why? That's the big question. Ted was just unhinged. Had been for a long time. But that night, he just snapped. Thankfully, one of my in-laws' neighbors saw Ted leaving his parents' house, looking very suspicious. When he left to come to our house, he had left his parents' front door wide open. Knowing about his condition, that neighbor decided to go inside and check on my in-laws. When they found them dead, they called for help, and then called Rosie to tell her what had happened. She, in turn, called me, fearing that Ted had some sick plan in mind. Good thing she did. Good thing that neighbor checked things out. Because otherwise, I may have innocently opened the door when Ted arrived at our home, not knowing what he had just done, not knowing what he was planning on doing to us. It's hard to recover from a situation like that, let me tell you, but we're trying, as a family. Ted was institutionalized, and we moved away from Austin, away from all of those bad memories. Here's a little-known incident that made me wary when I was travelling around South Africa. The story of Alison Botha and her horrifying encounter with pure evil. It was the night of December 18th, 1994. That evening, Alison, an ordinary 27-year-old woman, had been having a pizza party with her friends at her apartment in Port Elizabeth. After everyone else had left, Alison drove her lost friend back to her home, then made the journey back to her apartment. She pulled up into the parking lot, her mind no doubt preoccupied with the events of the evening, or of work, or of just getting into bed and relaxing. The same things that pass through all of our minds when we're in a calm and relaxed state of mind. But before Alison even had a chance to turn off her car engine, a man wielding a sharp blade emerged from the darkness and forced his way inside the car. He pushed her into the passenger side seat, took control of the vehicle, and locked the doors. Alison's own car had just become a death trap, as she was now stuck inside with an aggressive man waving a knife around, shouting at her and telling her to keep her mouth shut. The man introduced himself as Clinton and drove Alison to another location to pick up his accomplice. Now with two men in the car, Alison's chances of escaping had just dropped significantly. Worst of all, this was obviously not some crime of opportunity. These men had a plan. For Allison, it must have been all too clear that something terrible was about to happen to her. They didn't want her car, or her money, or anything in her apartment. They wanted her. Clinton and his accomplice drove Allison to the secluded outskirts of Port Elizabeth. There, they raped her. After they had finished, they decided Allison couldn't live to tell her story. At first, they tried suffocating her, which caused her to lose consciousness. Realizing that she wasn't dead, the two men took turns, plunging the blade into Allison's abdomen. They punctured her more than 30 times, disemboweling her. To make sure the job was done, they then slashed her throat 16 times. These slashes were so deep that her head was almost separated from her body. The two men then threw Allison out of the car and left her to die in the middle of nowhere atop a mound of sand and broken glass. After the men had driven off in her car, Allison amazingly regained consciousness. Realizing she was about to die, she wrote Clinton in the sand with her finger, along with the message, "I love you, Mum." But here's the craziest part of the story. After writing that message, Allison decided that she wasn't going to die that day after all, and somehow found the strength to crawl to the side of a nearby road. Her throat had been so thoroughly slashed that she had to hold her own head on with one hand as she crawled, because she realized if she didn't, it would have fallen off backwards. But her injured trachea had somehow remained functional, so she could still breathe, if only barely. Allison had to use her other hand to keep her intestines inside her abdomen. Imagine having to crawl without using your hands in that condition. Unbelievably, she made it to the roadside, where she collapsed and again lost consciousness. A veterinary student named Tian Elard, who was vacationing in Port Elizabeth, just so happened to be driving down that lonesome road. He saw Allison slumped in the dirt and immediately jumped into action. He used his veterinary knowledge to keep Allison alive as they waited for help. Incredibly, she survived. And not just that. Allison had paid close enough attention to the faces of her would-be killers that she remembered everything about them. She spent her recovery time in hospital looking through police photos until she finally came across the faces of the two men responsible. Franz de Troyes and Theuns Kruger, two men with a long history. They were both quickly apprehended and sentenced to life behind bars. In the years since her ordeal, Allison has travelled the world to give motivational speeches, inspiring others who have suffered at the hands of the cruel to come forward and share their stories. For her tireless work, she's won countless awards. "Life can sometimes make us feel like the victim," Allison once said. "Problems and hardships and traumas are dished out to all of us, and sometimes they can be divided very unfairly. Remind yourself that you do not have to take responsibility for what others do. Life is not a collection of what happens to you, but of how you've responded to what has happened to you." This happened to my mum in Barcelona about 20 years ago. There was an active killer in the area at the time who was targeting women, specifically blonde women. He had been linked to 2 cases already, and residents had been warned that he would likely strike again, so everyone should be on their guard. My mother, a blonde woman herself, had been working late one night. It was around 11:30 p.m. She had left her car in one of those multi-floor parking lots, but it had been a long day, and she couldn't remember exactly which floor she had parked on. She knew it was either the 2nd or 3rd floor, 50-50 chance. She took the elevator up to the 3rd floor and started looking around the very big, very dark space, clicking the button on her keys, hoping the car would flash its lights and reveal itself. There were several cars scattered around the place, but for the most part, the floor was empty. So, as you can imagine, any sound would have been very out of place. Her boots echoed as she walked from one end of the lot to the other. And then, she heard something. A footstep that wasn't her own. She froze in place and turned to look directly behind her. There was a man, half the parking lot away or so, watching her from behind a concrete pillar. The left side of his body hidden behind the concrete, the right side totally visible, like he was only half trying to hide. He must have been following her quietly, but then accidentally took a loud step. The place was too dark, and he was too far away for her to get a good look at his face, but she knew he was looking at her. There were likely no other people in the entire parking lot at that time of night, so no one else to run to for help, and this man was standing between her and the elevator she had used to get to the 3rd floor. Thankfully, there was another elevator, about 50 meters in the direction she had been heading in. She hadn't checked the entirety of the 3rd floor for her car, but scared and wanting to get away, she quickly paced to the elevator, hoping that she had parked on the 2nd floor after all. As she speedwalked, the sound of her footsteps reverberated throughout the lot, but she was sure she could hear another set behind her. She finally made it to the elevator, hit the 2nd floor button as fast as she could, and turned to see that same man behind a different pillar, this time much closer, poking his head around the corner, his face masked in darkness. The old elevator took its time getting down just to 1 floor, and when the doors did open, she ran out and scanned the entire level for her car. It was nowhere in sight. In a panic, she aimed her key in every direction, repeatedly hitting the open door button, hoping against hope that the car would flash and beep so she could find it and escape. But as she turned to look behind her, there he was, the man, coming through the stairwell door. He was walking, quickly, straight towards her. Panic set in, and my mum was going to run for the stairs on her side of the lot. She didn't think she could outrun the guy, but she had to at least try. But as she turned to run for that door, Lady Luck smiled upon her. The elevator on her side of the lot dinged, and a businessman got out. My mum had no idea who he was, but she ran up to this businessman and acted as if she knew him. "Oh, there you are, Manuel," she said loudly. "I've been looking everywhere for you." The businessman was confused at first, of course, what with a strange woman approaching him in an empty parking lot at midnight. But when he saw the shadowy figure behind her, he quickly realized what was happening. "Oh, hey! I finally found you," he said, playing along. With that, the man who had been following my mum turned back the way he had come and disappeared back into the stairwell. My mum thanked the businessman, who then escorted her to the 3rd floor to find her car. It had been up there all along, hidden around a corner. She thanked him for his help, believing that he had just saved her life, though of course the businessman said it was nothing. After that, my mum drove home as quickly as she could, making sure that nobody was following her. As soon as she got inside, she called the authorities and told them what had happened. Nothing came of it, of course, what with her not getting a good look at the guy's face. But to this day, she remains convinced that that man who was following her was the same who had claimed the lives of 2 other women in that district. That active killer who was never caught. Why is she so convinced of this? Because of the killer's modus operandi. In both of those previous cases, he had waited for the women to get inside their cars, then rushed them before they could lock the doors. Inside their vehicles, he took their lives. So, to that businessman, whoever and wherever you are, know that my family thanks you. Without you, my mum may not be here today, and I may have never existed in the first place. These days, I consider myself to be a good man, but that hasn't always been the case. In my past, I ran with a bad crowd, and to be honest, did some terrible things that I'm not proud of. This story doesn't paint me in a good light, and believe me, I know that, but I'm going to retell it the way I remember it, and I hope that you believe that people can and do change, because I'm not that kind of guy anymore. With all that out of the way, let me take you back to the days when I was a young man living in Rio de Janeiro. Like many young men in Brazil, I wound up in small gang life. As much as some of you will judge me for that, frankly speaking, I had nothing and no one in my life, had no money to speak of, and all of my old friends had gone down that path too. Running with a group, it gave me a sense of purpose, a feeling of belonging, like I had a family. But as I'd come to learn, you can't trust everyone in that life. I was 22 when this happened, just a street goon in my crew, a guy who pulled off small day-to-day jobs and ran errands for our boss, Carlos. Robberies, hold-ups, street deals, delivering a message, that sort of thing. But never killing. That wasn't my domain. I knew people in our crew who did that from time to time, but not guys like me, and not innocent people. We wanted money, sure, but we weren't psychos. None of us wanted to hurt anyone. It just sometimes came with the territory, I suppose. Anyway, it was around that time that Carlos decided to expand the crew. Now there must have been about 50 street-level guys in our crew, and for our day-to-day business, we worked in groups of 2 or 3. For the past year, I've been working with a partner. His name was Marcos. Marcos was a real cocky guy, but he always had my back, and we grew close during our year working side by side. Our boss, Carlos, decided to put one of the new crew members with us. You know, show him the ropes. This new kid's name was Luis. He was 18 or 19. Big guy, lots of muscle. Had these brown, crooked teeth, and these small, piercing eyes. From our first meeting, I knew I didn't like the guy, what with the way he held himself and looked at you. It's hard to explain, but when he talked, he always looked you straight in the eye, but never looked away, like he was constantly sizing you up or had some dark thoughts going through his mind. And when he smiled and exposed those big, brown teeth, his eyes never smiled along with his mouth, as if all his emotions were a front for a creature with no soul. Marcos, Luis and I were working the streets one afternoon. We saw a guy who looked like a naive tourist about to walk into this secluded alleyway and decided this was a good opportunity to grab some cash. We had just one gun between the 3 of us, and Marcos, our de facto leader, had given it to me. Luis asked me for the piece, said he was ready to take the lead on this one. As much as I didn't like the guy, the boss did want us to teach him, so I said, "Okay, tough guy, show us what you're made of." As I went to hand the piece over to him, Marcos stopped me. "Not yet," he said to me. "The kid's not ready to take the lead." Now, Marcos was usually a playful guy, but in that moment, he got real serious. He took the piece off me and started moving towards the alley, the one which the obviously lost tourist had gone into. Luis and I followed him. Together, the 3 of us ran up on the guy, surrounded him, and demanded his wallet, his watch, and his bag. The tourist complied, gave us everything we wanted, and cowered against the wall with his hands raised, clearly terrified. That was it. We'd gotten what we wanted, and it was time to get out. But as we all stood around the guy, a guy who clearly had nothing else to give, Luis coldly said, "Shoot him. Shoot him." I looked at Luis, and in that moment, all I can say is he had this look of a hungry dog about to rip apart a rabbit. His eyes were wide, his mouth open and almost salivating. It was the only true emotion I'd ever seen from the guy, and it chilled me to my core. Marcos told him to shut up, and the 3 of us ran from the alley. That was the moment I knew Luis was more than just a weird guy. He was an actual animal, and I thanked the Almighty that I hadn't given the piece to him. If I had, things would have ended very differently for that tourist, and there'd be a large dark spot on my conscience right now. Well, a larger one. I told my concerns to Marcos, and he agreed with me. Luis was bad news, and he had almost certainly taken lies before. We told the boss about the situation, and he gave Luis a stern warning. Told him not to pull stunts like that unnecessarily. The crew didn't need that kind of heat. Luis said he understood. No more than a week later, Carlos had a new job for us. Some business owner owed him some money, and he wanted us to go and collect the debt. He knew our concerns about Luis, but told us to take him along anyway. Said he just needed to learn the rules. Marcos and I arrived at the business owner's store, reluctantly bringing Luis along with us. Marcos kept the one piece we had in his waistband, so even if Luis snapped again, the cool-headed Marcos was still fully in control. We entered the store, and to our surprise, it's a woman behind the counter, the daughter of the owner. We asked her where her father was, and she says he won't be back until tomorrow. Marcos starts ranting, telling her our boss wants his money, and to hand over whatever's in the register. He keeps his piece in his waistband though, doesn't flash it about. The woman, again obviously terrified, opens up the register and begins to count the cash inside. The three of us stood there in silence while she counted, Luis standing in between Marcos and I. I turned my head to the left to look at Luis and saw that Marcos was watching him too. But Luis was looking straight ahead, his eyes fixed on the woman, with the same look he had with the tourist. Marcos and I share a glance. I can see he's concerned. "Hey, Luis," he begins to say. But before he could finish his sentence, Luis pulled a piece of his own that we didn't know he was carrying and began to raise his arm as if he was about to aim it at the woman. Marcos immediately went to grab his arm, and the piece goes off. The shot hit the wall beside the woman, just barely missing her. She screams and runs for the front door. I begin to try and grab the weapon from Luis's hand, but before I can, he breaks free from Marcos's grip, points the weapon at his chest, and fires. Marcos went down, and Luis fired into him several more times. I made a break for the exit. You can judge me for that if you want, but I know most people would do the same in my situation. As I ran, I distinctly remember hearing a mosquito fly past my ear. It didn't occur to me at the time, but I now realize that sound was a bullet. I just kept on running. Maybe Luis was chasing me, maybe he wasn't. I didn't turn to check. All I can say is, if he did chase me, I outran him. I immediately ran back to Carlos and told him what had happened, then took all of the money I had stashed and got out of town. I didn't want anything to do with that life after that. Cut all ties with Carlos and went somewhere he'd never find me. I knew the punishment for desertion, but at that point was willing to risk it. In the end, I ended up straightening myself out. Opened a business of my own, which did better than I expected, and have since started a community project that helps young men avoid winding up in that same life I did. This was all before the days of cell phones and the internet, so although I'm pretty sure of Marcos's fate, I don't know exactly what happened to Luis in the end. But from what I know about Carlos, things won't have ended well for him. It will have been slow, and it will have been painful. If that really is the case, then I'm glad I told the boss what had happened before I left town. My family is from Vietnam, and we all lived there until my dad got a job overseas and we had to move with him. Now I realize that in a lot of other countries, people tend to be less superstitious. But I have to say, growing up in Vietnam, people are far more accepting of the supernatural, and most of my family have stories involving paranormal entities or unexplainable phenomena. I have just one such story. It was the early 2000s. I must have been about 13 at the time, and my elder brother, 15. Our parents had taken us on a trip to the countryside to visit our grandparents. They lived literally in the middle of nowhere. When you picture Vietnam, you might conjure up images of rice paddies, sprawling green fields, dense trees, tall mountains, and thin, solitary roads. Well, it was pretty much exactly like that, and very far from the nearest town. That rural house had been in the family for a number of generations, and my grandparents had no intention of ever moving to the big city where we lived. As such, about twice a year or so, We'd have to go on these week-long trips and stay with them in their old farmhouse, I guess you'd call it. My brother and I always dreaded these trips. We were city boys, born and raised, used to life in Ho Chi Minh City, aka Saigon. These trips always bored us to tears. There were no young families in the area with other kids to play with. There were just old people and farm animals. Since we rarely ever got to see our grandparents, we weren't particularly close with them, and my grandma could be a mean old hag. She once chased us both around with a bamboo cane, trying to thrash us. Grandpa, on the other hand, we viewed as a stranger. He never spoke to us, nor to anyone else for that matter. He was basically a mute. As you can tell, we really couldn't see the point of these visits at all. But still, they were family, so there was no getting out of it. To begin with, that particular trip went about as expected. Grandma was her same old grumpy self, yelling at us for the slightest infraction. "Stop running in my house, this isn't a playground," versus, "Why are you so slow? Get out of my way, move faster," that kind of thing. Grandpa just stared at us blankly, never saying a word. My brother and I spent most of the daytime outside exploring the woods and fields, and most of the evenings in our joint bedroom area on the ground floor, watching movies on an old black and white TV. On the night of the incident, we stayed up well past our bedtime, quietly watching some action film which we were far too young to be viewing. We kept the volume on low so nobody could hear us, and kept our voices down for the same reason. Our parents catching us and getting angry was one thing, but if Grandma found out we were up at 2 a.m. watching trash, we might have given the old bag an aneurysm. Partway through the movie, my brother suddenly hit the mute button. "Shh," he whispered. "Do you hear that?" The two of us sat in silence in front of the muted TV, listening intently. Sure enough, we did hear something. Movement. Someone was coming down the hallway. We quickly turned off the TV, and both of us ran to our beds and pretended to be asleep. We laid there in silence, worried that we had just been rumbled by Grandma and were about to get punished. The sound of footsteps on the old wooden boards got progressively louder as whoever was in the hallway moved from one end to the other. The boards creaked, and it was clear that whoever it was outside our room. But the door didn't open, and nobody came in. Instead, we heard their steps get quieter and quieter as they rounded the corner and moved in the direction of the kitchen. My brother and I lay in silence, still honing our ears, when we heard the distinct sound of the front door sliding open. Oh, they'd gone outside. But at 2 a.m? Why? Without speaking, my brother and I turned to look at each other. After a few moments of hesitation, we both stood up and tiptoed over to the window, half ducking down as we peered outside, so only the tops of our heads were visible. To this day, I wish we hadn't looked, because it wasn't one of our family members out there. But there was something. A skinless corpse walking through the field outside the house, towards the nearby woods. The way it moved, the only way I can describe it is like that scene from Signs, the one where the alien steps out at the birthday party. Only this thing wasn't grey. It was red all over, its muscle tissue exposed. I ran from the room in a blind panic to wake my parents, my eyes filled with tears of fright. My brother, on the other hand, stayed behind and watched as the thing walked off and disappeared into the trees. He later told me that the thing looked back at him before it creeped into the tree line. He said it had a look of absolute terror on its face. Our parents and grandparents were all right there in their bedrooms. Grandma told us to stop our snivelling, told us we had both just seen an animal, and that the dark had made it look scary, nothing more. Our parents tried to reassure us that that must have been the case. But Grandpa, as always, remained quiet. We eventually calmed down and accepted their version of events. On the final day of the trip, Grandpa came into our room and sat down with us in private. For the first time in forever, he actually spoke to us. It had been so long that we had both forgotten what his voice sounded like. He asked us about school, sports, our friends, and of course, the trip. Had we had fun? We lied and said that we had. Well, apart from that night with the scary animal in the backyard. Grandpa smiled at us and began retelling stories from the old days. The days of the Vietnam War. How he had always been scared back then too. Scared for his family, for his friends, for himself. Scared of the soldiers, of the helicopters. But most of all, of the napalm. Orange death, he called it. The worst way to go. He had seen the effects of it firsthand when he was younger, not far from the very house we were in. Horrible stuff, he told us. It would stick to you, hot as the sun, and it would burn all of the skin right off you. He looked out the window, looked back at us, gave us a knowing wink, and went back to never saying a word to us ever again. For years, my brother and I have debated why our grandfather told us that story. Some of you might be thinking that he was just messing with us, that he was just a crazy old man who wanted to scare us. But that's not how we see it. To this day, we maintain that our grandfather was a quiet man, not because he was crazy, but because of all the things he had seen in the past, and that when he told us that story, it wasn't to scare us. Quite the opposite. He was trying to reassure us that we weren't crazy either. A way of telling us, I know what you saw, because I've seen it too. I hope the thing we saw that night was just an animal, but in my heart of hearts, I know it wasn't. My brother knows it too. And maybe, just maybe, so did our grandpa. A big thank you to my supporters on Patreon and on YouTube, especially my biggest supporters. That One Guy Thomas, Jessie Jug, Alex Greensall, Azrael Warakai, Beatrice Matarazzo, Charlie Lackey, Colin Monsma, Connor Louthan, Crawford K. McDonald, Expand On, Gina Valera, Gracearchie, Infamous-senpapi, Leonardo Martinez, Mackenzie Griffin, Myra Lancaster, Monica Mendoza, Nadine, Natalie Escobedo, Peter Loggerich, Philip Westra, Procupidine Natter, Sarah Ramirez, Taylor&Monica Gruenk, The Only Dorita, Zane, Ms. Crypto, Damien Bennett, The Deck of Cards, TNS Mum, Hamish K, and Lydia Glassley. Thank you guys so much for your continued support. Make sure you're subscribed and the bell icon's turned on. Keep an eye out for episode 2, and you'll be hearing from me again very soon. Until then, you all stay spooky. And remember, the best things happen in the dark.